Good evening, all. Just part two of the discussion between David from Catholic Versus and Joel Pearson from Religious Debates and Alan Kinsey. Let's just kick off. Joel, you go for it.
So, David, the reason that we kicked off this conversation was because you said you recently changed your mind and you decided to become a young Earth creationist.
Yeah, I guess the best way to relate what happened is to say that I've always wanted to be a young Earth creationist, but I never had the nerve to come out of the closet. And I just listened to a sermon or a talk, a religious talk by a priest who is a young Earth creationist. And his talk was about Mary and the church. But in that talk, there was a little 2-minute segment where he talked about how obviously evolution is false, theistic evolution is false, and it made a lot of sense. And now I feel comfortable to admit that I'm a young Earth creationist, but I've always wanted to be young Earth creationist. I've never liked the idea of theistic evolution. So I'm just very, very happy to now be a young Earth creationist and to be open about it.
So does that put you against the teaching of the Catholic Church, then, since they support evolution?
No, the Church allows various opinions about how the body came to be created by God. The only thing the Church stipulates dogmatically is that the soul, the human soul, is not a product of evolution. It's not a product of any natural process. The soul, human soul, is a product of special creation. The fiat of God creates the human soul. So we're allowed to believe in theistical evolution, young Earth, old Earth, intelligent design. I don't know. I hope that you know something about the landscape of creationism so you can sort of give me something to think about, because I really am a noob. I don't know that much about it. And all I know is that God created Adam and Eve out of nothing. He did not use evolution.
I noticed you said you've always wanted to be a new Earth creationist. No evidence needed, you just wanted to be.
Just because I want something to be true doesn't mean it's true. And just because I've stumbled upon one tiny theological argument that makes me comfortable coming out of the closet doesn't mean that I'm right. I'm not claiming to be right. I'm just claiming to be happy. There's a big difference, right? So I'm not claiming to be right. If I were to claim to be right, I would be in opposition to the church, because the church says, we don't know yet. We don't know. And let's let the scientists and the theologians battle it out. And there's some questions, like the question of God's grace versus free will, where it came to loggerheads within the church. And the Pope stepped in and said, look, we're not going to resolve this. Not now, not anytime soon. Stop fighting and just go your merry way. Investigate honestly and take into consideration everything that can help you to come to a decision. But right now, we can't come to a decision. So it's sort of the same thing with creation. The only thing that's been established so far is that the soul is created by special creation. But this whole idea of my desire for young Earth creationism to be true, it's neither here nor there. If tomorrow the church came out and pronounced that theistic evolution is the way that God created the human body, I would just bow and submit to that without a moment's hesitation. I wouldn't go kicking and scratching into conformity and into submission. I would just submit instantly, because that's what my relationship with the church is. I'm a Christian. I submit to Christ and his church.
So does it matter to you whether the belief is true?
Of course. Of course. That's the most important thing.
So if you had evidence supporting, say, an old Earth and not evidence supporting a young Earth, then you would just move back the other way?
No, I don't care how much evidence there is for the other positions. I have a theological justification for being young Earth. I know that I'm on the wrong side of science by all appearances. I know that. That's why I hesitated for 10 years to come out of the closet as a young Earth creationist, because it doesn't look good for this position. But I found one theological argument that made me comfortable saying I could be wrong, but at least now I have a justification. Before, I had no justification. It was just I wanted to believe. It was hoping against hope. I had nothing. I really had nothing. And now I have one argument, and that's good enough. So now I came out of the closet.
So you said that you do care whether it's true, but that you don't care whether it aligns with evidence? I don't see the connection there.
Well, because I don't trust theologians, philosophers, or scientists, or myself. I don't trust any human, not even the Pope. I only trust God Almighty. So if God Almighty allows the Pope to define a dogma that theistic evolution is the case, I'll go with it because I trust God. But I don't trust the Pope. I don't trust the bishops. I don't trust the theologians. I don't trust the philosophers. I don't trust the scientists. I don't trust you, and I don't trust myself. So I just go with God.
So that's the difference between the Pope saying something and him saying something officially.
Yeah, it's not dogmatic. I mean, the last 6 popes have been on board with theistic evolution, right? They're free to endorse it. They're free to get excited about it. They're free to favor it and to think that it's probably true. They're free. And I'm free too. And if I thought that I were showing any disrespect to the last 6 popes, I wouldn't come out of the closet. And there is a teaching in the early church. It was St. Augustine who said that we have to be careful when we have controversial positions. We have to be careful that we're not bringing more mockery and disdain and hatred onto Mother Church. And there is a risk of that, and I'm aware of that. And my way of justifying being a young earth creationist, even though it seems wacky and weird, my way of justifying that is to say that I'm willing to change. I'm not claiming that it's true. I just hope that it's true. And now I'm comfortable publicly saying that I hope that it's true. So I hope you see the distinction there.
Yeah, so you said it was a theological point that made you lean in that direction, although you were already thinking in that vein, presumably because of Genesis and the way it narrates things.
Yeah. I was already bending over backwards, and then there was a feather of theological insight that made me fall back completely onto my back into that prone position where I can be mocked and ridiculed by everyone, non-Christians and Christians alike. Okay. So I'm not afraid of scorn and ridicule. And the theological, I think you're asking me what the theological point was that tipped me over the edge, right?
Yeah, that would be interesting, yeah.
It's all about Mary. That lecture that I was listening to was all about Mary, how she is the Alpha and the Omega of the church. If we're going to talk about the church, we need to look to Mary as an example. Mary with her purity and with her holiness and with her virginity and the fact that she's a mother, although being a virgin, she's a mother, and the church is the same way. Mary is perfect and immaculate, and so is the church. And so in this context of the discussion of that one teaching, that one doctrine that Mary is the Immaculate Conception, this priest mentioned sort of in an offhand way that Adam cannot be immaculately conceived in the womb of a non-human beast, as theistic evolution claims. He cannot be immaculately conceived in the womb of any creature. Therefore, he was created by special creation, by fiat. Because we know that until the fall, he was immaculate, and it's only at the fall that he became in a state of sin. He was sinless up until that time. So either he was immaculately conceived, in which case Mary is not the one unique immaculate conception as the church teaches clearly, or he was not conceived in the womb at all. He was just created by special creation. So this is the one theological point. There may be good counter arguments, theologically good, sound Catholic arguments that are based on other pronouncements by other popes and other dogmas that qualify what it is to be the unique Immaculate Conception in the case of Mary. Maybe there's a way where Adam can be immaculately conceived in the womb of a beast, but I haven't heard any argument to that effect.
I'm curious about this womb of a beast thing. Is that something that theistic evolution teaches?
Of course. Of course.
So how does that work? There's a non-human that gives birth to a human.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I find repugnant as a Christian. I don't like it.
That sounds like an abandonment of evolution. It's a very odd thing to say.
I may be misrepresenting it because as I told you before we did this interview, I don't know a lot about the science. I don't even know a lot about the theology, frankly. I basically just have this fondness for the literal or quasi-literal or more literal interpretation of Genesis. Genesis is one of my favorite books. I love the stories. I remember even in Sunday school as a Protestant boy loving the stories. The sort of Sunday school presentation, you can grasp these colorful images, Adam and Eve and the fall and Noah's Ark and the flood and all these sorts of things. The Tower of Babel, and I want to maintain that.
Just to set the science straight on it, evolution doesn't say that a non-human gave birth to a human. That's not how evolution works. It's far more gradual than that. You'd have to zoom out tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years before you could draw a line and say there's humans on that side and not on that side of this line. There was never an individual who was different from their parents to that extent. It's like trying to look at a photograph of yourself every single day of your course of aging and try and find one where on one side you were a child and then the next photograph you were an adult. There's no clear dividing line.
Yeah. I'd love for you to talk to someone that subscribes to theistic evolution and find out what they actually believe. I don't actually know what they believe, but I was just listening to a lecture by that Sensus Fidelium. It's sort of like a quote-unquote traditional Catholic YouTube channel. But there was a talk on there about all the different flood stories around the world. And not only that, but all the different genealogies that go back to Noah and Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And there are many of these genealogies going back to Noah and his 3 children. I don't know if you're aware of them, but they're all over, like on every continent and in most countries. So it's really interesting.
Well, so the ones that have a common theme of the boat and the rescuing the animals and all that tend to be focused around the Mesopotamian region. There are other flood stories elsewhere, but they're very different stories.
Yeah, but the genealogies from the 4 corners of the world, basically, there are people claiming to go back to Noah or someone whose name is sort of a cognate of Noah. And of course, it would take a lifetime to sort of unravel the mystery of these wild claims that are made by anthropologists, right? Like, I mean, I don't have time to research anything. That's why I don't really waste my time with looking at the evidence for young Earth creationism, looking at the evidence for old Earth creationism or theistic evolution. I don't have time for that because, I mean, you could just spin your fancy tale based on this mountain of data. And once you're happy with your story that it looks coherent, then you think you know the truth. But I think that's naive.
Yeah, I suppose the age of the Earth becomes more relevant in positions where you have a job to do that's relevant to the age of the Earth. So, for example, astronomy. It's impossible for the Earth to be that old when, for example, there was a photograph taken recently, or I say a photograph, an image taken of a galaxy that's 50 million light years away. So obviously, for time to have extended that long, it's impossible for the Earth to be so young.
I'm sure that people are going to assume that there's all kinds of baggage that I've accepted about cosmology, about astronomy, and about anthropology and civilizations and genetics and everything else. I'm sure there are all sorts of assumptions that are being made about what I believe, but I haven't looked at any of that. I don't know anything about it. And I don't want to deny any data, any evidence. I don't want to deny any of it. But I also am not committed to modeling any of it. And when I say I'm a young Earth creationist, I'm not saying that the Earth is 6,000 years old. I have no idea. I haven't looked into it.
That's based on Usher's calculation, isn't it?
I've heard that, but I'm just not that terribly interested in it. But I mean, if someone asked me, do you think the world is 6,000 to 10,000 years old? I'd say I have no idea. I haven't looked into it. I haven't looked at the data.
Well, no, so if you take in the story of Genesis literally in the sense of the young Earth creationism and the general creation story, does that mean you also take the firmament story literally? For example, the Noah's flood involved the waters coming down from a window being opened in the sky. And there was water over and under the Earth. Yeah,
I don't believe that. I don't want to believe that, but I'm willing to believe that. It seems like it's going that one step further into cuckoo land. But, now we're getting into like flat Earth territory and all that sort of stuff.
Yes, that's the logical extension of the young Earth.
Is there anything that I've already lived that sort of rules out the flat Earth?
Have you ever driven towards a mountain?
Yeah.
Which bit of the mountain do you see first?
The top, yeah.
Yeah, that's instantly destroys the flat Earth.
Have you got... Oh, yeah, okay, I wanted to ask you... feel free, by the way, to pull me out of young Earth creationism. Like you'd be doing me a favor if it's not true, right? But in that vein, I was just wondering, is there a technology that depends on evolution? Because, quantum physics gives us the technology that we're using to communicate now to a large extent. Are there technologies?
Absolutely, yeah. All of modern biology. So all of modern biology depends on evolution. Virtually all of modern psychology depends on evolution because the way you understand human thought processes is based on the environmental survival advantages earlier on. I'm just reading a book actually called Survival of the Prettiest, which is a psychologist's perspective on beauty and how beauty is based on evolved human reflexes. And our modern living is only very short time. We've only been, for the last 12,000 years, an agricultural species. So before that, we were hunter-gatherers, small roving bands where it was easy for us to understand who everyone was. So the anonymity of modern cultures and cities is quite new to us. Our brains haven't evolved to cope with that. And there's all sorts of other things where you can explain human behavior through the evolutionary model. And of course, geologists, oil companies, very much interested in evolution and deep geological time, because that's how they find what they're looking for. So yeah, huge areas of scientific disciplines and practical disciplines rely on evolution and deep time.
Yeah, I have heard something about a distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. Do you want to talk about what that is? Is it real?
Yeah, sure. So microevolution is adaptation, mutations, changes within a species. Macroevolution is when you get two strands of species that are separated physically so they can't interact with each other, and they diverge sufficiently that when they get back together, they are no longer able to interbreed because they've evolved down separate paths, but they're so clearly related, they're almost identical to each other.
Okay. And so some people I've heard claim that there is no actual missing link between humans and non-humans. There were a couple of spoofs that were made, like Lucy and stuff like that. Can you talk about that?
Piltdown Man was a hoax. Lucy is not a hoax, actually. She was one of hundreds of examples of the same species. So that goes back, let me think, 6 million years or something like that. I forget the exact amount. But there's quite a long chain of different connections going back millions of years where you can connect humans onto the other great apes. And not only that, but the thing is, fossils are actually some of the weakest evidence for evolution. The other paths of evidence are far stronger. Phylogeny is the most powerful connection where you can actually see genetically and in terms of taxonomy, the links branching everything back up to a common root.
Interesting, yeah. So Aaron Ra is a big guy in the phylogeny project, right?
Yes, quite a fan of him. I helped the project slightly, but really I didn't do that much compared to the guys doing the real work, programming the database, entering all the information. And then just that whole, his phylogeny challenge is, I think, unbeaten so far. I think the only way you can lose is by refusing to answer a direct question.
Okay, I have no idea what you're talking about. Can you tell me what the challenge is?
Yeah, sure. So the challenge, or the basic challenge, is to show him two kinds, so completely unrelated creatures of any kind, life forms of any kind, that were individually created by God and who are not related to each other.
I see. Okay.
So if you follow him down the branching tree of life and the connections, you actually end up always back at the beginning of the tree. So any two things that you can name that are alive are related in some way.
Okay. And so is this a project that will constantly be gathering more and more evidence, or is there an end goal like with the Human Genome Project where it was completed?
Oh, the Phylogeny Explorer project, I don't think it will ever be completed because life is too complex. The goal is ultimately to map all of life, which if you consider that 99.99 etc. % of life forms are already extinct, that's a ridiculous task and you could never possibly find all of them. Because, of course, you've got these extinction events where something like 3/4 of all life dies and then we start again.
Okay. Yeah, this is one of the arguments against theistic evolution, is that God would not have used this messy trial and error technique to give birth to humans, and sort of a trail of blood and disease and misery behind that human creation story, right?
Yeah, I can see why that works. In fact, have you seen Christopher Hitchens talk specifically about that, where he says, say you give 100,000 years for humans to evolve. And he says, okay, so you've got 90,000 years, God watches with indifference. And then it's only recently that he goes, all right, now we better go down there and intervene. So all the people who, lived and died before that don't get saved. And you have this very small group of people in recent history, say the last 2,000 years, where he goes, okay, now we'll go down and intervene and do the whole Jesus thing.
Yeah, well, that's not what the church teaches. The church teaches that those who lived before Judaism, or those who lived before the Jewish Messiah came, they're called the righteous, right? And they went down to the underworld when they died. And then when Jesus was killed, he went down and he rescued them. You can see that famous icon of the harrowing of hell. It's not hell. It's a sort of limbo of the righteous. But he's going down and he's taking up Adam and Eve by their hand and bringing them up to heaven, because the gates of heaven were closed up until that point. So the gates of heaven were opened, and then the righteous went up from quote unquote hell, this limbo of the righteous.
Yeah, it's a later theological point that I think they forgot to address in the original stories.
In the Bible?
Yeah, you've got, because of course you've got Paul's letters that don't really address it. The Gospels don't really cover it.
Yeah, the Gospels cover it. The Gospels cover it. Jesus himself talks about it, how Abraham's up in heaven, Lazarus and the rich man. Do you remember the parable?
Yes, I do remember. And Lazarus was later turned into a new character in John's Gospel. He started out as a parable character and then was repurposed into a full character.
There are lots of names that repeat in the Bible. I wouldn't be too quick to jump to that conclusion. But
the weird thing about Lazarus is that in John's Gospel, he's a central character. He's actually the reason that Jesus is executed. But the other three Gospels that came before John had never heard of Lazarus.
What leads you to believe they hadn't heard of him?
Well, they don't mention him at all.
Oh, okay.
But in John's, he's the disciple Jesus loved, and he is also the main reason for Jesus being pulled up on charges and then eventually executed. It specifically says it's because of the resurrection of Lazarus that they start to plot against him. Yeah, learning about the Gospels and the New Testament in particular, it's fascinating to see what went into it, who wrote it, why they wrote it, what sort of motivations they had, where they disagree with each other. There's this whole pattern of how they were assembled, and also really interesting is the stuff that was left out. I'm sure you're aware of many apocrypha. There's about 40 odd Gospels, and only a few of them made it in.
Yeah, what I find more interesting is the fact that we don't have any original manuscripts. We just have copies. So that to me is more interesting. And that fits in with my Catholic worldview, where I have a living magisterium, I have a living church who interprets the sacred deposit of faith for me. And the sacred deposit of faith is sacred tradition and sacred scripture. So I find it fascinating that we don't have the original manuscripts. We only have copies, and there are many discrepancies among the copies. And I find it fascinating. It lends more weight to my Catholic faith, and it sort of, in a way, it undermines all non-Catholic forms of Christianity. Those who would claim to put their faith in the Bible alone, I don't know how they do it without divine protection from teaching error concerning faith and morals. I don't know how they do it.
Through ignorance, I suspect, because obviously the first two intact codices we have are the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus, I think. And both of them have books that we don't have, and we have books that they don't have. So it's clearly been modified over the years. It's also just interesting to see the ones that almost didn't make it in, like James nearly didn't make it in, Esther nearly didn't make it in. These books where people argued back and forth over it and seemed to have fought over which books were holy and which books weren't.
And Revelations never made it in.
Yeah,
that was a later push in.
And that's not even counting the stories inside the books that were then added later, like the Pericope Adulterae. The story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery was added centuries later. And the ending of Mark's got 5 different endings, and the original actually cut off at 16 verse 8. There's all these things where we've got the textual evidence to show. You go back to the oldest, the best manuscripts, and they don't have these stories. They were added in later. And in the case of the woman in adultery, that was actually added in different places in different manuscripts because they had to squeeze it in on the bottom of a parchment.
It makes a good movie line, though, let's be honest.
It is probably the best story. I think of all the stories you can have in the New Testament, that is the best story.
One of the thought experiments I like to play with in terms of the Bible and the mystery of the Bible is that it is, in a way, arbitrary what books made it into the canon of Scripture and which ones didn't. And it was arbitrary in the sense that the church said, and whether they were right or wrong, it's bound. What they bound on earth is now bound in heaven. So, and what they loosed on earth is loosed in heaven. So it's a sort of arbitrary in that way, but God let them, because God is so powerful, he let the church, which is admittedly full of frail and fallible humans, make these decisions. And then he ratified the decision. It's like he's just going with it. It's like he let the church decide, and he can work with anything. And if the church had picked other writings to canonize, God would have worked with that. I think this is a little bit controversial. It's a little bit wacky. I've never ever heard anyone in the church teach this idea. It's just a fantasy I have to sort of reconcile. How can we even know what's in the Bible? And maybe there are good scholarly reasons why the church thinks that she has certain knowledge about what the original text said and where they are and what belongs in and what's out. But I like playing with this idea that it doesn't actually matter because God gave us the power in the church to bind and to loose, and we've bound. So now it's bound, and we're going with it. We've built this tradition, and it is a sacred tradition because that's what God allowed the church to do. What do you think of that idea?
I think it's an interesting way of reconciling the differences, because obviously for Bart Ehrman, the reason that he left, or one of the things that first shook his faith, I think the reason he left was theodicy, but the thing that first shook his faith was the idea that, well, if God wrote these words originally, then why did he not preserve them? Why is it that we don't know what the original words written in the Bible were?
Who is this now?
Bart Ehrman is one of the best-known textual critics of the Bible, of the New Testament specifically. He's a professor in New Testament studies. He literally wrote the textbook on it.
Oh, which denomination is he?
Well, he's now an atheist, but he was a Baptist. So he originally went to Moody Bible Institute to learn about the New Testament, study it in the original language to find out what it meant. And he's now one of the world's foremost experts on the New Testament and the history of Christian forgery and interpolation and the polemics that Christians wrote about each other. So he writes scholarly work, but he also writes for the general public. So that's one of the things that's great about his work, is that he's writing for the common man. Whereas it can be quite difficult otherwise to keep track of where people are going, because scholars will tend to descend into using really archaic language that is difficult to track. But he does write popular books.
Yeah, it's all very complicated. I like to stick to principles that I can pin down and grasp and commit to. And going back to our original subject of the young earth creationism, I know that everything's stacked against me, and I know that I'm not really going to look into the evidence because it doesn't interest me that much. But I do feel the weight of the arguments all around me, and I'm just sort of enjoying the freedom that the church gives me to believe this. I'm not sure why the church gives me the freedom to believe this. Is it because it doesn't matter? It's not essential to my salvation? Or is it because there might be something to it? I don't know, but I'm just enjoying my freedom.
I think it's more the whole Reformation and the change of law in general, isn't it? Because a long time ago, heresy would have gotten you killed.
Yeah. Well, I can guarantee if there was a death penalty associated with young earth creationism, then I would probably get in line with that.
Well, I mean, before not adhering to young earth creationism would have got you killed.
What do you mean?
As in, it used to be the standard party line of the church.
Oh, that's another reason why I'm attracted to it, is because it is a long-standing tradition, no?
Yeah, if you go back to the fundamentals, they were young earth creationists. It would appear in the biblical days. So, for example, Jesus seemed to have believed that Moses existed and that Adam existed, which is a serious problem for people who believe in theistic evolution, because, of course, in evolution, Adam never existed. And if you follow archaeology, then Moses never existed. So there's a lot of problems. Abraham as well was another one that was disproved in the 1970s, I think. And the consensus has now moved towards them not existing. So there's obviously pockets of resistance which generally are religiously motivated.
What? Not that you're an expert, but what are the numbers like? I mean, in the Christian world, what do you think? Is it maybe 50% that are young earth creationists, or 10%, or what?
I think once you factor in most of the world, then most young earth creationists are actually Muslims. But within Christianity, most Christians, I would say, don't understand evolution. But I think most are accepting of evolution, and it's the smaller pockets in the Africas and in the like the southern United States, for example. They tend to be people who are young earth creationists. It's also where the flat earth movement took off. But in Europe, you'll find that most Christians will accept evolution, although I suspect that the majority of people don't really understand it, because every time I meet someone who goes against evolution and doesn't understand evolution, it's precisely because they don't know what evolution is. They'll raise these objections to it, which turn out to be nothing to do with evolution.
Yeah. I think that education is the key. And I think if we're educating people into evolution, then good, faithful Catholics are having their faith weakened. And you would agree with me, because you'd say, yeah, because Catholicism is false and evolution is true. But I would say Catholicism is true, but evolution is a really good way of weakening the Catholic faith, and it's a danger because the reality is that God's all powerful and he can do whatever he wants. And even if there's a lot of evidence against young earth creationism, whether you believe in Catholicism or not, you will agree with me that it's a more robust position in terms of clinging to the Catholic faith. And like you just said, the Bible and Jesus, it's a more robust position, digging your heels in and saying, well, I don't care about the mountains of evidence. God will explain it to me in heaven. And I'm just going to stick with what Jesus said. Jesus believed in Noah, and I believe in Noah. So do you agree with me? I know we're on different sides of the fence here, but do you agree with me that it is a better position if you want to maintain your faith or no?
It's certainly a faith-based position.
Yeah, I mean, obviously.
That's the nature of faith, is to go against evidence of it.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to say that the nature of faith is to go against the evidence, but there is something to the mystery of faith where it appears to be going against the consensus, or at least the conventional wisdom of the age, or whatever it is, you know. But I feel like my faith is strengthened. I'm exhilarated by my renewed faith in the young earth creationism, and I'm cautious because I do see the mountains of evidence that are against me. But it's sort of like when you're in a relationship, let's say you and your wife aren't getting along, but then you move to a new town and everyone's against you, then your little differences disappear and you just hunker down and you dig in your heels and, you know, you really grow together and you've got a common enemy and this sort of thing. So I think that this is sort of the position I find myself as a young earth creationist. Like, everyone's against me, not in a way that's personal, but there are lots of people who are antagonistic to the idea of young earth creationism. And so that sort of gives me a nice romantic space where I can just be more alone with God, more isolated and more faithful in that way. So I'm just trying to portray sort of the psychology of being an outsider, being marginalized, and how it's kind of romantic.
Yeah, well, you can actually see this in the demographics of America, for example, the tribalism. So as there raise objections to evolution, what you've actually got is there are more American Christians leaving religion and becoming atheist, agnostic, or however you want to call it, non-religious. But there are also more fundamentalist, extremist religious people. So what's happening is this polarization where people go one way or the other and don't stay in the middle. So you're losing this sort of tolerant middle ground, and you end up with people completely leaving religion and people fully embracing religion. Like, you know, the kinds of people who are anti-vaccination and kill children with faith healing and that kind of thing. So you end up with this disturbing divide where you end up with no one in the middle to bridge the gap. So it's quite a concerning thing, really. This is the sort of tribalism that leads to warfare. As far as going with faith, though, that's pretty much what they said about heliocentrism. When we discovered that the Earth is not the center of the universe, then it was a very theologically sore point, and people would refuse to believe it for the theological reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I've had people emailing me and saying, you know, flat Earth is next, and then geocentrism, the whole thing. Well, I guess geocentrism is a moot point. Once you're flat Earther, then the geocentrism is not even relevant, right?
Yeah, because then the sun is just a picture.
Yeah, I did look up at the sun yesterday, or was it today? It might have been today. But I did look up at the sun, and I did ask myself, does it look like it's just a luminary, just a light in the sky, or does it look like a big burning ball? And I mean, my whole life I've assumed that it's a big burning ball of hydrogen.
You can definitely feel the heat from it on your face.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's actually a probe heading towards the sun. Did you know there's going to be a TV show where flat earthers try to find the edge? They're going to Antarctica. I don't know why. If they're looking for the edge, why are they going to Antarctica? They could go in literally any direction.
I heard this little lecture, and it was talking about no one's allowed to go to Antarctica, and it's like armed guards are guarding it.
They think that NASA has a fleet large enough. And don't forget, they don't think that Antarctica's down at the bottom of the globe. They think Antarctica is in all directions. So they think that there's a fleet the size of the Earth circling the whole Earth.
Wow.
It's brilliant. Although there are flat earthers all around the globe.
Yeah.
No need to rub it in. And you do understand that I'm willing to walk away from young earth creationism if it's not true or if the church says so, right?
I suppose, yeah. So how would you know if it's not true? So if you disregard evidence...
Well, I don't disregard evidence. I'm willing to understand the problem of induction and that people can spin wild tales with the same pile of evidence. we can make a story that will fit the data. But the way I would know is if it becomes a dogma of the church. And I don't think that's going to happen within my lifetime. So I'm pretty much free to believe.
But do you actually believe that faith supersedes evidence?
Well, I mean, evidence is real. I mean, I'm not going to deny, like, I mean, if I go to the restaurant and there's a fly in my soup, I'm not just going to be like, oh, well, God is good, therefore this fly isn't real and swallow it. I'm going to acknowledge reality. That's reality. But the question is, how did it get there? You know, there are different explanations for how that fly got into my soup, but I'm not going to deny the fact that the fly's in my soup. Same thing with like the fossil record or with, stories of ancient civilizations or whatever. But I'm not even committed to, I don't even know how old civilizations are. I'm not committed to, like I said, to the 6,000 or 10,000 year old thing. But yes, I do give precedence to infallible dogmas of the church. And the reason I do that is because there's a hierarchy of sciences. The natural sciences are good, but they're limited. And then we have above that, we have the science of philosophy. And then above that, theology. And finally, above that is God. God Almighty is science itself. God is knowledge, right? God is perfect in that way. So obviously, if the Catholic Church is what she claims to be, and if she has the infallible truths of God Almighty defined in these dogmas, and there are, probably about 500 dogmas that are defined, then they will be my absolute rock solid core of belief until such time as I abandon Jesus Christ as a false Messiah. If I have good reason to abandon Jesus Christ as a false Messiah, then I'll end up being a generic monotheist again or go back to solipsism.
So I would actually put science and theology both under philosophy, with philosophy being a very generic, broad, just a way of thinking about things. And then you have subsections in that. But do you know what it is about the scientific method that makes it so good at finding out what reality is?
Repeatability, objectivity, and independent studies, blah, blah, blah.
I think falsifiability is the real key. So
yeah, my faith is falsifiable.
You're susceptible to confirmation bias if you go looking for things to confirm you. Like, when you're talking about spinning tails based on the evidence. But the scientific method is to ignore all the evidence that supports you and go, okay, that goes in the pile over there. But is there any single piece of evidence that proves me wrong? And if you can't find anything like that, then you've got a pretty good chance of saying, okay, this is probably true then.
How many years have scientists been looking at evolution? How many years has it been?
Over 150 years of people, both from the theological side and from the scientific side, trying to disprove evolution. And that's what makes it the strongest theory in all of science. In fact, it rivals gravity for just the sheer amount of evidence supporting it.
Yeah. So I find it hard to believe that everyone's in on it and they're just playing along. And because there are people on both sides, like you said, atheist and theist, that are playing along with the story of evolution, I find that really hard to believe that people have that much ill will or that they're that easily deceived by Satan that they can independently get their science wrong in the same way. So, it's like I said, it doesn't look too good for my position, but I'm not going to look too deeply into it because it's not essential for my salvation. But I'll keep an ear open, and now that people know that I'm a young earth creationist, they're welcome to send me emails and links and arguments. And you've presented good arguments. A lot of people have good arguments and I'm open to them. And I just don't want to do the work. I don't want to occupy myself with trying to find out the arguments, but people are free to send them to me. I'd appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. I still have another stack of them.
Yeah, I'm not so sure that you are a young earth creationist because, for a start, you don't believe it's the earth is 6,000 years old. You're not sure whether evolution is or isn't. So I'm not so sure that you perhaps wish to be under that category, but I don't think you are actually.
Maybe, yeah, maybe.
Well, so what do you think of the usual method of explaining the evidence by people who have actually attempted apologetics for young earth creationism, where they say that God created the world to look old, but it's actually young?
I don't like that.
I don't like that either. I think that makes God deceptive.
Yeah, I don't like that.
They don't like me
God
pointing
created all those apostles.
Yeah, so for anyone to oppose evolution, but also acknowledge all this evidence for evolution, they would have to say that their God is a deceiver, basically, to go with that.
Yeah, I'll have to find out what people believe. I'm reaching out now. I reached out to one Catholic young earth creationist, and he agreed to come on. I don't know if you know him. His name is Hugh Owen. Do you know him?
I haven't heard of him now.
Okay. But I'll be interviewing him, and I'll assess his approach. But
Didn't you have a talk with Aaron coming up as well?
Yeah, possibly, tentatively. He agreed. He's very busy, but he did agree to come back. He's a bit annoyed with me because I said I'm a young Earth creationist now. But
yeah, I feel like he may go on a rant.
Yeah, that's going to happen.
He's a nice guy, but I mean, I can't believe he gives me the time of day. Like, I mean, I email him and he always responds to me, and he tentatively agreed to come back in early May. So I'm really looking forward to that. Most of my listeners on YouTube are atheists, and there's nothing they enjoy more than my Catholic versus atheist talks, because they just chalk it up as a win every time. Like, you lost again. I'm not trying to win. That's the thing. I'm just trying to talk to people, and I don't mind losing.
Yeah, dialogue. I did notice actually something I wanted to address, which is some of the really rude comments underneath that. And I think they're just giving us a bad name. And I want to apologize on behalf of the atheists who are horrified by the people who just give you grief and insult you all the time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I noticed you're very nice to me and in the comments. And did you notice that one guy, Robert White? He's very venomous.
There was one guy who mentioned something about your wife, which was completely inappropriate.
That was Robert White, yeah.
I'm not entirely sure what they want to achieve, because all you're going to do insulting people is drive them further away. It's a terrible way to argue.
Yeah, there's something troubling him, there's something troubling him. And he may have been abused by a priest for all I know. You don't know what people go through.
I do think there is a phase in deconversion when people leave any kind of cult, where they get upset at being deceived for so long, and that I went through the angry phase myself as well. But if you follow the logical extension of determinism, it's very difficult to be angry at people, because if you had, do you remember the "but for the grace of God, there go I" quote?
Yeah. Where
you're basically like, well, if I was born in their position with the exact same DNA as them and have the exact same upbringing, that's where I would be. I would be doing that right now. And to say otherwise is just arrogance, and it flies in the face of all the evidence. So yeah, I try to be sympathetic with people in any position where it could easily have been me.
Do you remember what St. Paul said? He said, "What do you have that you have not received? And if you have received it, why are you boasting like you didn't receive it?"
Yeah, absolutely. It gives you a sense of perspective when you consider that so much of where you are is just the luck of the draw. It's based on your family and friends around you, the experiences that you've had. What are we if not just a collection of memories? And based on the trajectory that led us here, very little of it was actually up to our own decision.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us the second time around, and it's been enjoyable.
For sure. Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, it was a pleasure as always. I'm sure we can arrange another one.
Yeah, thanks very much.
See ya.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.